Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel discussion. We thank you all so much for being here this evening. My name is Larry Hayman. I'm the Assistant Director and Pre-Law Advisor at the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture and the Center for Advising Career and Experiential Learning. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the CLJC, the ACLU of Ohio University, and Phi Alpha Delta Pre-Law Fraternity. Tonight's panel, Race, Violence, and Justice, where we will both examine and discuss the Ahmaud Arbery and Kyle Rittenhouse verdicts. While one of our goals this evening is to examine these verdicts through expert political and legal analysis, we also want to open up space to discuss these topics with our audience, especially students. The format of tonight's program, just so that everyone knows what to expect, is that I'll give the panelists an opportunity to provide some analysis and commentary on the topic, and then we will turn it over for discussion and questions from students. Briefly, the facts of the two cases. On February 23rd, 2020, so just under 2 years ago, 3 white residents of Satilla Shores, Georgia, chased down and murdered jogger Ahmaud Arbery, one of them filming the incident on a cell phone camera. Later that year, in August of 2020, 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse fatally shot 2 white men in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where protests had erupted after a police shooting of Jacob Blake, an African-American man. While Rittenhouse was acquitted, all 3 defendants in the Arbery case were convicted of murder in state court and are indeed going under trial right now in federal court of hate crime charges. Both of the cases highlight issues related to stand your ground laws, self-defense, and the role of the criminal process. The panelists that are joining me this evening to discuss these topics are Dr. Vince Youngkuntz and attorney Olayemi Olurin. Dr. Youngkuntz is an associate professor of political science here at Ohio University and a faculty affiliate of the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture. Attorney Olurin is a 2015 graduate of Ohio University, where she earned a BA in political science, a minor in African American studies, and a certificate in law, justice, and culture. She's a public defender in New York City. We'll first start with Dr. Youngkuntz. Can you please provide us some frameworks for thinking about these issues?
Sure, thank you. Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to start with a quote that's meant to get us to be thinking, in not really a provocative way, but I want to rethink Malcolm X and something he used to say about white people. He used to say the white man is the devil. He was questioned about that a lot, and so he responded by saying the following. He said, unless we call one white man by name a devil, we are not speaking of any individual white man. We're speaking of the collective white man's historical record. We're speaking of the collective white man's cruelties and evils and greeds that have seen him act like a devil toward the non-white man. Any intelligent, honest, objective person could not fail to realize that this white man's slave trade and his subsequent devilish actions are directly responsible for not only the presence of this black man in America, but also for the condition in which we find this black man here. You cannot find one black man, I do not care who he is, who has been personally damaged in some way by the devilish acts of the collective white man. And I start here because Malcolm X is onto something really important, and that I will argue, and it's that the identity of whiteness is an inherently irredeemable identity structure that has shaped most aspects of our lives since the invention of the white race. And so, first of all, just to really mention quickly, so when we talk about this sort of collective white person, we're thinking about an identity, not like Malcolm X said in his quote, not a specific person per se, but this sort of collective identity over time. And so I want to argue again that this is an irredeemable identity structure, and that one of the biggest problems we've had is we've not really interrogated it enough. So if you want to think about coming out of the civil rights movement in the 1970s, a couple of things happened. One was we had this idea of toleration But I grew up in the 70s, and I remember sitting in Catholic school, and the nuns would tell us we need to be tolerant. But when we would sort of elaborate on it, not the nuns per se, but the white people around me, the adults, would basically say something along the lines of, well, you can continue to think what you want to think. You can continue to hold your racist beliefs and ideology, but you just have to sort of like tolerate the existence of Black people in this space and on the margins. Well, that's not really progress at all. And then when white people started to be challenged in a variety of ways, they became, not all white people, or many white people became defensive. So we had these things emerge called reverse discrimination, political correctness, cancel culture. In my view, many of these things are a reaction to being challenged about one's identity and racism. And so we haven't had, it's sort of, to me, there's a sort of absurdity that emerged after the civil rights movement related to this. It's sort of this idea of like, I'm being victimized by my own racism. So there's a construction of, being victimized because of what one cannot say something racist, which is very, very problematic, obviously. So what I like us to do is think through this identity and sort of how it was formed and how it emerged and its sort of inherent nature. So as we know, whiteness was formed through basically colonization. It was formed with violence, brutality, theft, lies, murder on a massive scale. So we have slavery, colonialism, settler colonialism, Jim Crow 1 and 2, Holocaust, institutional racism through educational system, economic system, healthcare, criminal justice system, housing, food security, health, human trafficking, the political system, on and on. And so what I think about is, I take it as whiteness is like a structure. And to me, the structure pervades all the institutions that we have in our society. And so for me, a structure, the way I'm using structure is sort of like an overall dominant discourse, a series of narratives, stories we tell ourselves, concepts, visions, norms, thinkable thoughts that infuse itself into the consciousness of everyday people, surrounding everything and perpetuating white privileged institutions and individuals throughout society, and establishing whiteness as power, privilege, property, priority, protection. So we have this identity, whiteness, that claimed in order to colonize and to take and steal massive amounts of land and then to exploit people, claimed that it is superior, that inherently superior identity. Well, from the get-go, that's a false claim, obviously. And so in order to attempt to enforce this claim, there was engagement in all these efforts to get the accoutrements of whiteness, white superiority that didn't exist. And so we have enormous amounts of violence, and we know this history. Hopefully we know much of this history. But that's sort of a quick context, and fast forward to something that emerged with this. So I want to argue that there's a racialized state of exception, so which is basically violence with impunity. So when there's an emergency, we know this by going through the pandemic, that when there is an emergency, many times a person in power or people in power would declare a state of emergency. And that allows them to do things they normally would not be able to do. So they can do things that are, basically outside the legal norms that we normally operate by. For instance, telling us that we have to shelter at home during the pandemic. And this is a very powerful thing. It's very powerful for a leader to claim something as an emergency in a state of exception, because it allows them to expand their powers and to use power that's much more, can be much more forceful. What I want to argue is that what we've done in the United States in particular, but around the globe as well, is we created a racialized state of exception, so that when when, let's say, police officers are encountering a situation where there might be a Black person, and they will automatically treat this person as though they themselves are an emergency, an inherent threat. So the racialized state of exception involves this sort of white framework that looks at anybody, Black, brown, as an inherent threat to directly and to a society at large. And when you take that perspective, that's your framework in your interactions with Black people in this country, you are then creating a state of exception in which you think to yourself that you can then use extraordinary means, power, force, brutality to supposedly deal with a supposed threat that never existed. And so what we've had time and time again is the invention of threats that never existed, the creation of threats, the forcing of threats, the forcing of emergencies that weren't there. And then falling back on this idea that I was in danger and I needed to defend myself. This has just happened just a few weeks ago in Minnesota with Amir Locke, who is lying asleep in his bed, and the police do a no-knock warrant and come in and literally create an emergency that did not exist, and then use force and claim it's justified because they were threatened. This happened to me with Rittenhouse. This happened with in the Ahmaud Arbery case. So when we as a society thinking about whiteness as an identity, when we use a framework that we've used from the beginning, arguing that groups of people are inherently threatening due to the race, and then anytime that there's any interaction with groups of people who are deemed inherently threatening, we create them, we construct them as themselves being emergencies and threats. And so what's would normally be, or supposedly normally would be unreasonable, becomes reasonable. Concepts such as like, what is justified force? There are no boundaries to what justified force can then be. And so we have this group-based defamation of people to justify terrorism, brutality, and this is used in big scale, and then in everyday life, from situation to situation. And so what I'd like to hopefully present is this is just a framework from which we can examine some of these cases, and that Black and brown people in America are living in a perpetual, pervasive state of emergency themselves, but also a hostile environment, a series of environments where everything from subway to the subway sandwich shop to the swimming pool to the bedroom to the living room and eating ice cream, every single space is potentially one of hostility, and it's always there. And so this is the framework I'd like to bring to thinking about these cases, but in all the cases that are involved, because there are hundreds and thousands of cases where we've seen these things happen, where we see brutality, we see force used that, would seem to be excessive, but then when it goes through this sort of white framework of, of state of exception, inherent threat, it gets justified. This, in my view, a couple of things real quick. First, to me, this creates a sort of a racially sociopathic treatment of people of color in this country, because with all these things that come together, you also have a situation where there's no sort of conscience involved. And Charles Mills talks about these issues. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that we're at a point where we need to treat whiteness as an affiliation group, as something that people choose into and choose out of, as something that people have agency in. So we don't want to treat it as though there's sort of this structure that is just that determines individual behavior, but it's something that has been there and was constructed from the beginning, and it influences. But there's an interactional relationship between individuals in the structure and the identity. To me, I'll just finish real quick by saying that this is something that is not really new. There are many theorists in the past and legal analysts who have put forth this argument that we're not going to get anywhere as long as we have white identity still in effect. So you look at, James Baldwin talked about, if you want to be committed to a cause, for white people, it's dangerous because what's at stake is their very identity. You look at someone like Derek Bell, who says racism is permanent, and if you read through his essays and Faces at the Bottom of the Well, you can conclude that he's saying it's permanent because this identity is still in effect. So anyway, those are my beginning comments.
Thank you, Attorney Olurin.
Oh, you ready for me? Okay. All right, everybody. So I think these cases are both really good examples of how systemic racism works in application, right? And when I say systemic racism, I mean this, because oftentimes people get bogged down when you say, oh, there's racism in the criminal justice system. Well, oh, there are Black prosecutors, there are Black cops, there are Black this. When I say systemic racism, it's this idea that the systems, the institutions themselves have this built in. They work in a way in order to perpetuate and maintain white supremacy. And the reason why I say these cases are a perfect example of that is neither case they wanted to bring. I think that's a very important starting point when we look at these cases. In the case of Ahmaud Arbery, it was out for a day, 30-something days before they brought charges. They had to fire and charge the prosecutor in that case. That's how much corruption went on there. If you see the body cam footage, the police response to the men that killed Ahmaud Arbery was to treat them like they were the victims. They didn't even, like they had gone through something. They looked at this dead Black man in the street and that was the action. In the same way, in Wisconsin, when we get Kyle Rittenhouse, somebody that went to a protest armed with weapons, is in opposition to the protest, has shot 3 people, killed 2 of them. The response there was not to charge them. And there's a reason for that. In both cases, we have people that I think it would be hard to argue legitimately are not agents of white supremacy in some way. And I don't say that just putting it on them. Kyle Rittenhouse kicks it with white supremacists. So do the people that were convicted in the Arbery trials, right? And I think these cases are important because oftentimes when we talk about racism, people, first of all, people fight whether or not racism is a legitimate actor in the criminal system at all. But 2, people think it's not a collective problem. They think of race as a Black person problem. And I think these cases demonstrate how racism and systemic racism is actually a problem that affects us as a collective, because nobody in the Rittenhouse cases that were killed were Black. Nobody's Black, right? This is just a matter of people that support this Black Lives Matter movement. But in the same way there, he's allowed to go to this protest. He's allowed to walk around armed with his weapon and to basically appoint himself as some kind of security or protector of these buildings that he doesn't work for in this community that he doesn't live in. He's able to do that. And the reason he's able to do that is because the police support what are those aims. And similarly, a lot of the times in the coverage of Rittenhouse's case, people talk a lot about the judge's rulings, that the judge didn't want them to be called victims, or, that the judge was very favorable to Rittenhouse. I think what's important in that case, and I think really hones in what happens there, is the prosecutor didn't have a problem with it either. The prosecutor didn't intend to have them called victims. The prosecutor makes an executive decision not to raise white supremacy or racism as an argument there. The prosecutor there refers to the victims in the case as rioters. The prosecutor there was disparaging towards the Black Lives Matter protest because that was how the system felt. So I think that is an important point to remember there. It's not just that the defense in that case is making this argument. It's that the prosecutor was aligned with that argument to a large degree, which is why they never wanted to bring charges, which is why, if you follow that case, it's not a surprising verdict, not just because we know how these things go or how we expect white people to be treated in the criminal system, not just for those reasons, but it's not surprising because if you were watching, everybody was pretty much aligned throughout the case. A lot of what we felt and what was being talked about socially and in the media were not the opinions of the actual legal actors in the system. So I think it's an example there. And then when you look at the same thing in Arbery, in order to get that case, people had to protest all around the country just to get those charges brought. Body cam footage had to be put out. Petitions had to happen. A prosecutor had to be fired. They had to be charged in order to get those 3 men convicted. So I think that's a framework for us to look at these cases as to how racism is not just this problem or this boogeyman that we have out, in society that we talk about at an individual level, but it's something that is instituted. And I think often people have a pushback to discussions about systemic racism or racism because they feel personally attacked. I think as a human being, you're going to have that. If you feel like, oh, you're damning me or you're insulting me or you're criticizing me, you're going to be more defensive. But I think it kind of takes that away if you recognize it as, okay, we exist in this system. This is already at play, right? We're already actors in the system. This is happening. I know that as a defense attorney, when I go into court, it's not like it's only happening there. It's not happening on the defense. It exists all throughout the system. And you have to look at where am I? What's my role? How am I participating in that? How can I be complicit in that? So I think our framework for looking at it is that, okay, the system we already exist in is this way. We say that historically, this is a reality in America. We look at this as a reality in terms of the criminal system. So it's unavoidable. This idea, it's not a personal attack. We're as a person who first moved to America in 2008, I did not, in my mind, I didn't know anything about racism. No one had said it to me. I come from a Black majority country. No one had said it. And by the time I was learning in college, I'm like, ooh, I'm problematic as well. You know what I mean? Like you internalize a lot of what's around you. And so I think a good way for us to look at this discussion is from there. How do these cases illustrate what's actually happening and how do we go forward and how this is a collective problem for us to address as a group? That's me.
Yeah, Dr. Youngkoons, do you have any response to anything that Olayemi has said?
Oh, everything was, she knows this better than anybody, first of all. And forwards, backwards, in and out. She knows this better than anyone. She knows it better than me, for sure. I do think, I think that the analyses can go together. So, this is talk about the systemic racism, institutional racism, the idea that we're working within a system that's there. We're not necessarily talking about individual people, but at some point hopefully we get to the point where we say, okay, this person, I as a white person, I know enough about the situation I'm in that I can't claim ignorance anymore. I can't claim that I go along with something or I accept something because I'm ignorant. I think that white people need to step up and be more responsible. And like I said, we should be much more attuned to how we interact with the system, because systems, institutions are ultimately, people. And so we need to figure out ways in which we can, in my view, dismantle this identity that emerged in these ways. But I think that everything that Olayemi is saying, it fits really well. I think our analyses are fitting well together, and I think that it's really important to her point about saying, this is about the system. This isn't about, I think that there's a way in which also when we get defensive, we're focusing on ourselves when we really need to focus on other people and the pain and suffering that they're going through. So she knows this better than I do, though.
A way I try to frame this case in terms of recognizing why it's a collective issue. Like I try to frame this case as being beyond just as moral outrage, which by the way is valid. Be outraged. You can be outraged and have that. But in terms of, if you look at this case in terms of self-defense law, just as a lawyer, it contradicts what is our understanding of self-defense. Self-defense law is, and it varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but generally the rule in Wisconsin is you're allowed to use the proportionate amount of force that you think is reasonably necessary to stop the danger you think is coming towards you. In this case, the first two men shot are completely unarmed, right? The argument that is raised by the defense in this case, by Rittenhouse, is that, and this is a completely nonsensical argument. Of all the things, I will give merit where merit is to be given. But the argument raised by the defense is Rosenbaum, the first man shot and killed by Rittenhouse, is that Rosenbaum may have gotten my gun and turned my gun on me and killed me. So that is what makes him the threat. That is ass backwards. And we need to understand that creates a slippery slope that affects all of us. If the understanding of self-defense becomes the person with the weapon is in danger, oh no, the person without the weapon is actually the danger. Because what if you got my weapon? Like, imagine if that's the understanding we have for protests, and you have to think about it too. These protests that are happening, a lot is done to keep these protests safe. A lot is done. And in places like Wisconsin, Rittenhouse is not the only person there with a gun who is open carry or anything like that. He's not. And he's probably not the only person who would love to act as an antagonist. But people tend to, there's some reluctance to, you know, the law. I can't just shoot people willy-nilly and act like this. But if we have a precedent that says, hey, you could go to a protest where you vocally, openly, you put on your own social media, you've espoused that you are anti this view, anti this group, you don't support what they're doing, you can go armed and then say, hey, the people that are there, I'm fearful of them. They make me scared, with no acknowledgement to creation of the peril. That puts anybody at these protests in danger. It's not just about a race problem. It goes beyond just me saying, oh, Kyle Rittenhouse is a white supremacist, or Kyle Rittenhouse is a racist and he was allowed to do this. Forget that, because it doesn't even matter. If he is allowed on just the law says, oh, this will become self-defense, he can go to this protest where he didn't need to be, he can choose to be there, voluntarily get there, go there, be armed. And when he decides, when he engages in this point of violence, then it's, oh, I was scared. That is a problem that affects all of us, not just at protests that have anything to do with race, have anything to do with the criminal system. That is a dangerous precedent completely. And I think that is a good framework for looking at how the law not only legitimizes racism or these issues that we have in society, but the law will legitimize and codify things that will become not only dangerous to us, but they infringe upon our rights, because you have a right to self-defense. So this idea that, oh, this is what self-defense becomes, no acknowledgement for creation at peril, is the antithesis of everything that it is, everything it was, and everything it's intended to be. So I think that is a good legal framework for people that are looking for a linchpin, because I think a lot of times people struggle with feeling like cases are about, you know, moral this or how you feel about it. Especially people have a mindset of, if something is, people are morally outraged about something, but it goes one way in the courts, they automatically take it as what happened in the court is legitimate. You know what I mean? That must be what the legitimate thing, and we just feel this way about it. I'm here to tell you, it's illegitimate in the court. What happened in the court was illegitimate. But where I think that ties into our whole conversation about racism is, the prosecutor didn't raise a lot of these arguments. He didn't approach his case from that perspective. And a lot of it is why, right? I covered the case twice a week on the Law and Crime Network. And I was like, what is going on here? What is happening? And I'm like, you must not want it to go this way. Like, there are certain things that happened in that case. It's undisputed that Rittenhouse was not supposed to have a gun. We know that. He wasn't supposed to have this gun. We know there was the straw man purchase from his friend and all of this. All they had to do was charge the right statute for having the gun. The prosecutor made a mistake, didn't realize on this big case, you just didn't realize you charged the wrong thing. They have to dismiss even so much as just the possession charge. The man didn't walk away with a possession charge, y'all. Not a possession charge, when we know it's things like that you have to take into consideration, all the different actors, how the system is playing out. So that to me is my framework, and y'all can question us up.
Yeah, so I want to encourage folks to put their questions in the chat, either on YouTube and Facebook, so that you can engage with Attorney Olurin and Dr. Youngkuntz here. But Olayemi, you bring up a great point, and that is, you know, someone who's covered both of these cases fairly extensively, especially in the media providing commentary, were either of the verdicts surprising to you? And if so, why or why not?
No, in the Rittenhouse case, I was not surprised at all. No, I was not surprised. Like, I wouldn't have been surprised even if I hadn't been following it. If I hadn't been following it and I was just a Black person that tuned in at the 9th hour, I'd have been like, that don't shock me. You know what I mean? Because one, not just on your reality or race, but that's a historical fact. Historically, people that identify as abolitionists are in conjunction and allies with what is a Black movement, because before abolition was considered was this criminal justice movement, it was a movement in terms of slavery, right? And that's always been the response. The law and, you know, white groups and white nationalists have always taken an adversarial response to those people. So I expect, even though the victims in that case are white, they are a particular kind of white person, you know what I mean, that'll be deemed a race traitor or whatever you have you. So I expected that kind of treatment. I would have expected on that level, but I watched the trial. So I expected it because the prosecutor was not in it to win it, okay? Wasn't in it to win it. Like, if you start your case just as a matter of being an attorney, being persuasive, if you start off by refusing to call the dead people in your own case as victims, you won't even call them. I've never you won't call them victims. And in all my practice, yes, theoretically, defense attorneys will motion to the court not to call them victims or words that they think are, prejudicial. You don't get it. You don't get it. The only time I've seen the judge say, no, you can't call them victims is in mock trial. I've never seen it happen in court for real. So the fact that happened, it was something that the prosecutor was cool with because he had no intention of calling them victims. And his own opening statement begins by characterizing the protests as riots. They completely leave out any aspect of, they didn't touch into Rittenhouse's internet history of his racist comments and da-da-da-da-da. They really only kind of focused on, they brought it up for maybe 2 seconds that on his TikTok he had said, bro, I'm just trying to get famous. But the problem with that is they weren't making any arguments because and this is again ties back into what happens with the feelings of the state is they don't view his behavior as wrong or problematic or as a white supremacist, so they don't frame him as such. They don't make those arguments. So I knew what was happening in court was very different than how we were discussing it in public circles. So I wasn't surprised for those reasons when it came to Rittenhouse. And then once they put him on the stand to do all his fake crying and blubbering and sorry, listen, if there are any Rittenhouse fans, I'm so sorry, but that there wasn't persuasive. So I already knew there. I knew that was going to happen. I knew he was going to walk. And then in the case of Arbery, listen, people, and I want to say this to anybody who is taking these verdicts this way. They throw us a bone here and there. That's what the George Floyd verdict was. That's what the Arbery verdict was. We'll give you these wins. All the while, police and white supremacists continue to kill Black people every single day. And I wish I was being hyperbolic. I wish I was, but literally over 1,000 and over 1,100 people were killed last year by police, and that's who they admit to. That's the ones they are classifying as deaths caused by the states and by police. So over 1,100 people are killed. As many as 3 people are being killed every day by police, and that's by itself, not even just with white supremacists or people acting as agents of the police, because that is what was happening in the Arbery case. You have these 3 white guys see a Black guy running around his own neighborhood and decide he doesn't belong there. So that's profiling, but not just that. It's the added. What's important to recognize that it's one thing to profile, right? It's one thing to profile. It's one thing to be prejudiced. It's one thing to be racist by itself. It's another thing to feel like you have the authority over another person who should be an equal member of this community, of the society. It's another thing to say, hey, I'm going to get in my car, follow this guy, chase him, you know what I mean? Demand to get into a fight with him and shoot him. You know what I mean? Oh, I'm scared. Oh, it's self-defense. No, it's not. And an important note is one of the people in the case, one of the McMichaels had many years ago had once had a citizen's arrest power that he worked for the DA's office that had been suspended, formally suspended, had not done the paperwork, had not done anything he did to keep that current. But here you are, knowing you don't possess this particular right. I'm going to go follow him. I'm going to go do this. I'm going to go question him because why? Allegedly, there have been some break-ins that have been determined he didn't have anything to do with in any event. But so no, I wasn't surprised. I was, because at that point, by the time they decided to bring the charges, it was a response to international outrage. I think I'm echoing. It might be me echoing on. Yeah. Oh, you gotta mute you while I talk, Dr. J, because it's gonna make me echo. All right. Yeah. So. No, I wasn't particularly surprised by either verdict. I mean, if they hadn't convicted them in the Arbery case, that wouldn't have surprised me either. But if they decided to throw us that bone, it didn't shock me because at the time, think about how many other cases were going on. We had Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, a lot of cases like Amir Law, Casey Goodson. I can think of a significant amount of those cases that were happening that you didn't hear about again, that didn't get any charges pressed. So yeah, the couple that they gave us national attention to, and they actually had the charges go forward, they were going to do it. So it didn't shock me. It didn't surprise me at all. Dr. J.
Just a couple quick things. I mean, when you talked about how long it took to bring charges, and then they were forced to bring charges, like you said, the public outcry and such, and then the emergence of that video for the Ahmaud Arbery case. It speaks to lots of things, and this, but the vast majority of prosecutors are white in this country, and think about the way they make these decisions. I mean, like you said, you mentioned that they didn't see it as problematic, right? They see this as like, this is a normal reaction kind of thing. And it's just the points at which these decisions are made. There's so many points and there's so many different parts of it, but there's sort of, you see the lining up of a certain kind of way of thinking about these things, the way of thinking about threats, way of thinking about violence, the way of thinking about reasonableness, and you know, it just all comes down on one side and over again, and it's just horrific. It's all horrific.
We have some student questions that have started to come in, this specifically at Olayemi. Do you think there are any legal opportunities for redress to block such a dangerous self-defense precedent?
Yeah, I mean, yes, right? Like, yes, like factually, yes. That is a Wisconsin, so that's a, you know, the law can influence all over the place, right? Obviously, if I see an argument made somewhere, I could always try to make the same argument in my jurisdiction. But what happens in Wisconsin doesn't bind, you know, everybody to do that just factually, right? And I mean, yeah, a case could go up, another case could happen, it could be decided differently, or a case can be challenged, and the precedent can change, or different rulings. Yes, I think so. But I do think I think the verdict has implications on how people go about dealing with protests. Because a lot of times I try to make sure when people think about justice or addressing problems in the criminal system, we have to recognize what the stakes are. And in cases like this, people are dead, right? Like, people are dead. So what we do after the fact doesn't do anything to change the fact that lives are lost, and nothing will be sufficient, you know what I mean, to compare to that. So I think, yeah, the law can respond to it differently. But it's a matter of how the people themselves respond to what they know, what they believe the law, how they believe the law is going to respond. So there are people that wouldn't have gone to the protest at all, you know what I mean, wouldn't have gone at all, or people that went, you know what I mean, were armed but didn't antagonize anybody or didn't engage because they were thinking of certain consequences in their mind that might feel differently and say, you know what, I'll fight first. And actually, and let me just be clear, it doesn't just endanger the people that are going to the protest. It also endangers the people that are going to the protest, rightfully so, the people who are doing the protesting. But it also endangers the people that go there with weapons too, because it's important to remember the third man that Rittenhouse shoots has a gun, and he hesitates to even shoot. He's seeing all this happen, but he hesitates, even though he has a gun, he legally has a gun, he sees what's going on, but he's scared because no one wants to get arrested or end up in the criminal, you know what I mean? Or they know how it's going to respond. So he hesitates. Now, what happens if in the future, somebody else in that same position says, you know what? He's allowed to kill us. He's going to kill us. You know what I mean? He's going to shoot us. The law won't punish him or whatever it is. Shoot first, ask questions later. And you might get that. You might get on both ends. You get people who will go to the protest and say, hey, I could go with my gun. I could antagonize these people. And then you get people at the protest themselves who say, rather than try to peacefully resolve this, shoot first because I'm in danger. This person could shoot me and they won't get any consequences. So I think, yeah, the law definitely has a way to respond to it. But the problem is when the law already gives people the idea that they could behave in a certain way and how that exposes us to danger going forward. So yes and no.
Yeah, and I think this walks us right into what this question is, and perhaps you partially answered it in your response to that question, but it is, how do you think that this relates to the overall strengthening and blurring of stand your ground laws and possession of firearms in public places?
I think, first of all, stand your ground gets muddied period, just in terms of whoever gets the right, because I would argue that like Black people don't have a stand your ground right in America, right? That's a whole other.
Can I just interrupt you really quickly? Can you kind of basically explain what stand your ground is? Yeah.
Oh, stand your ground. You don't have the duty to retreat, essentially, right? Like if I have my weapon, or I feel like I'm in danger or whatever, I get to stand my ground, right? Like, it's essentially the colloquial, we can understand it. It has different meanings jurisdictionally, like actual, how they decide to apply at different places. But generally, it's that, basically, I could walk away, but I don't have to walk away, and that's important. I think that's important because, it's very important, right? If I don't have to walk away, And I think it muddies it in I think it muddies it and it opens it to a lot of, which I think is a problem in the criminal system in many ways, but a lot of discretion, because then who gets to stand their ground? Think about it like this. Rittenhouse is argument, right? Self-defense. I have my gun. This is my right to my gun. I think I'm in danger. I should be able to stand my ground, right? Cool. And that's accepted. But in the very same trial, the third guy, who also legally had a weapon, you know what I mean, and shot only after Rittenhouse had shot two people, shot and killed two people. Then when he shot and that was used against him, it's like, this guy admit to the fact that he shot at him. Yeah, he shot at him after he killed two people and with his legal weapon. So how come it's not, you know what I mean? Like, it depends. It depends. I think it muddies it. But I think stand your ground has always been, I'm trying to find the scholarly way to say some old bullshit. But I went with that. I went with some old bullshit. That's my answer.
Well, if I could jump in real quick, it's also how you define what you're retreating from. How you define what is a conflict or what is a potential conflict. A white man in Texas several months ago awoke to a man in his driveway who was pulling into the driveway to pull out and turn around. He shot and he killed him. Like, how this framework for defining what is threatening, to me, so that then I can stand my ground, is just it's warped. The whole thing is warped. Going back throughout the entire system, we see this over and over again. Like Olayemi said, this whole issue of self-defense. Again, what's the emergency? What are you defending oneself from? And Rittenhouse goes in and creates these situations, and then claims self-defense. I mean, without his gun and without his intervening and everything, there would have been no emergency.
And the law to look at things as this. If anybody goes to law school, you'll be very frustrated with this in due time. But the reasonable person standard, right? It's this idea that based on what the reasonable person would think. So it's was your fare legitimate, or would a reasonable person think that you had a right to be in fare, or think that the fare was this dangerous? And I think that in and of itself, that standard, which is why we have all these different jurisdictions, because who's a reasonable person, right? Because reasonable minds can disagree. I think if you ask me, to me, the Rittenhouse argument has never made sense on a reasonable level. This idea that, especially if I just painted, and again, this will always make me mad because the prosecutor didn't frame it this way, but let's think about this reasonably. What they concede to, what their argument is essentially, is that Rosenbaum was erratic. Is that he's mentally ill, he is having a mental health episode, and he's running around, or he's chasing Kyle, and Rittenhouse is running, and he runs, he falls, all these different things. At no point does his big weapon that is strapped to him, even when he falls down, never gets loose. The weapon never falls, never in danger, whatever. So where do we come up with this idea that a reasonable person would believe that this mentally ill person, whatever, was going to catch him, tackle him, get the weapon, turn it around on him and shoot him? Where was that communicated as the intention? Is that a reasonable belief? Do we even think that the reasonable or average person has those kind of abilities? Because not for nothing, I've never shot a gun. I've never held a gun. Even if I was tripping out and I was going to go run after a person with a gun, the odds that I figure that one out, you know what I mean? Low. So it depends. It depends on where you're at, who's the reasonable person, and what we think based on the circumstances. So that's the reasonable person. That's the standard.
And to go on, to piggyback on that, I don't know how many people are familiar with the Daniel Prude case, but here is a situation where a man is literally naked in the middle of a street at like 2 a.m. in Rochester, New York. Naked. We're surrounded by police officers who then handcuffed us behind his back, and put what they call a spit hood over his head so he can't see, and still somehow thought that it was reasonable to then press upon him with their knee into his head and his chest to the point where he dies of asphyxiation. And again, these are police officers fully armed with all their protective gear, and a single person who has no ability to do any harm to, I don't know, there are more vulnerable positions, I guess, but that's a pretty vulnerable position to be without clothing, without anything, hands behind your back, kneeling on the ground, hood over your head, and then eventually put on face down on the ground. And still, they felt, if you watch that video is one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in my life. And I've seen a lot of disturbing things. And Look, again, how is that reasonable? Where is the justified use of force? I mean, this idea of reasonableness, when it intersects with race and racism, it has no, there are no bounds. It could be, anything could be reasonable, just about anything.
Right.
Olayemi, I'll let you respond if you, but we have some other questions on the floor.
I'll take the question, because if I go down this rabbit hole, I was about to give y'all every case just like that Daniel Prude case. I listen, you know, I got the cases. I'll show you all how this has happened a billion times. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna take the questions.
Yeah, so this question is for Dr. Young-Kuntz. So many other marginalized groups are in states of emergency, which are usually ignored. Do white folks have the ability to create a definition of that state of emergency by virtue of their privilege in society?
Okay, so I don't know if I understand the question exactly, but I don't.
You redo the question, like what do you mean? Like, do white people have an ability to create a state of emergency? Is that what we said?
To create a definition of that state of emergency for marginalized groups.
Like, what counts as a state of emergency for marginalized?
I believe that's the intention of the question. Yes.
There's two.
Before you start, Dr. J, because you know the two of y'all white on the screen. Let me tell y'all the answer is no. Not that not that you can't. I don't know about whether or not you can, but you damn sure shouldn't be. That's how you get canceled. Listen, no. But you can answer it scholarly. I just want to let y'all know up front. The general consensus is going to be on stuff like that. That when it comes to race or what is a state of emergency or racial problems, or whether or not we're in like a state of crisis in groups, who's going to be left to how that's defined is always going to be the groups themselves. The groups are always going to be the premier authority, I think, on creating that. But go ahead, you handle that, Dr. J. You're the scholar here.
It's not about it. It doesn't even have to be scholarly. Like you said, no, there's no that ability. I mean, like, but there's I'm not sure what the question exactly is meant to say. Is it meant to say, is it a state of emergency, or is it being defined as a state of emergency, or be defined as emergency, or being in a state of emergency? There's a kind of different things, but either way, you know, if you have a group that has literally based on this creating a pervasive series of states of emergencies that can intervene and act with violence, impunity, with impunity, like how could they? The answer is yeah. I mean, why should I even keep talking? You're right. Olayemi was right from the get. So.
But if you meant the question, if we misunderstood the question to whichever student asked it, just go ahead and rephrase it, and I'll make sure we answer you with the substantive answer you're looking for if we understood it wrong, because that happens.
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering if the question was about sort of if we're dealing with other marginalized communities as a white person, can I see when someone is in dire distress or they're in an emergency? If that's the question, then I think that yeah, there are certainly there are people who can see someone in distress.
I think the answer is always going to be yeah, though. I think if we're really honest, all of the marginalized groups are always in a state of emergency, right? It depends, because like, what do you call it, right? It can't just be when the media happens to pay attention to what's going on. Every problem that every different racial group or marginalized group is speaking to is an ongoing, consistent, persistent problem, right? Like whether or not we're talking about Amir or Locke, they've had that's been happening every day, right? Like it's just about whether or not the media is focusing on it, you're focusing on it. Same thing with like Asian groups, the hatred that they're getting. These are ongoing historical problems that have never gone anywhere, which is a whole other conversation for the permanence of racism and these problems. But yes, so I think it's probably that they're always in a state of emergency. But you get those questions, Larry.
You both mentioned outrage. The student said we're feeling that and how it's justified. What can we do to channel this rage into progress? I know so many of us feel helpless.
So you want me to go? I'll go. Just because I feel a sense of everyday outrage, right? So let me tell you this. When I was in undergrad, that was when I decided I was writing my thesis with Dr. Sullivan, actually. That's when I decided I was going to be a public defender because the Mike Brown had just been killed. The Ferguson protests were happening. And I felt like I'm not doing anything. I feel outraged. I don't know where to put this. And I didn't want to be somebody that like academically, like I know what the problems are. I know what's happening. I know what the issues are, and I'm outraged about it and I'm talking about it, but I'm not doing anything about it. That was how I felt. And that was why I decided I wanted to be a public defender, especially because Black people are overrepresented in the criminal system, but underrepresented in terms of legal representation. That being said, I get people out of jail every day, and every day I feel like I'm not doing anything. You'll never feel, there are a million different ways you can get involved, right? And none of what you do is ever going to feel like you are making great change or you're doing a big thing. The problem is overwhelming. It has been going on for hundreds of years, and it's going to be going on after. Like, I don't expect to ever see any true, the truest of progress of the world I want to see in my lifetime. So I want to be clear that if you're looking for a way to satisfy that feeling, you're never going to feel that way. You're probably going to spend the rest of your career, when you look at like the James Baldwin and the Angela Davises and all of them, they are talking about the same thing they've been talking about for 40, 50 years. You know what I mean? They talk about it till the day they're dead. These are real problems that you're just chipping away at, right? You're going to feel like a harm reductionist. So I think you have to give yourself the grace of living with outrage, right? Like recognizing that if this is the work that you're going to do, if these are the problems that you're going to care about, you're always going to feel this. It's going to continue, because even when if at best, right? At best, you create the change that prevents the problems you don't want to see happen. So you're not going to see the evidence of it, right? Like if I'm doing things, or I'm doing things to prevent something, the next Black person from being killed by police, or the next person from being incarcerated, then at best I don't see it happen. So you'll never feel like you see the progress, but you'll always see when it doesn't happen. You'll see, you know what I mean, when this person was killed, but not all the times maybe what you did stopped that from happening. You see all the time, like I've gotten a bunch of people out of jail, and maybe I do things that change that might prevent more people from going to jail, but every day I'm still going to be confronted with all the cases of people that are in jail. You know what I mean? So it depends. I think you can go out in your community, right? I think education, first of all, is a major way that you affect the system that people like to underwrite. They undersell what it is to like speak up and what it is to learn and to share that. But it's a big thing, because when you think about it, I always say, I never get tired of singing my academics, my people that educated me, flowers, and there's a reason for that. If those people didn't educate me, if they didn't bring these kinds of things to my attention, if they didn't teach me about it, then I wouldn't have gone out and done anything, you know what I mean, in that line of work. So it's about like who you inspire, changing social consciousness, because a lot of what happens legally and politically happens based on what is popular opinion or what they think people are going to be outraged about. People were tough on crime because it was popular for politicians to be tough on crime. When it became a way where, there's a carved out leftist political spectrum where there are politicians you will get shit on for being tough on crime or, being pro-carceral and stuff like that, then you see politicians stop being like that. So I think there's something to what is educating people, whether formally and informally, getting involved in, local organizations and local grassroots efforts, or becoming a lawyer or writing or speaking on things. But I think a lot of I think you have to expect that you're going to live in a perpetual state of outrage to some degree, and just figuring out what can I do to feel like I'm at least chipping away at this problem. But as far as the outrage itself, I think it's there to stay. I feel literally like I feel that all the time. I've gotten like 800 people out of prison, and I was sobbing like 2 hours before this or whatever over emotion. Like, I feel like I'm not doing nothing. You're gonna feel that way. I don't think you're ever gonna not feel that. So I hope that is a little bit of a comforting answer, but I think the reality is, you just gotta go out and do shit with the understanding that you are one little piece of a huge puzzle, and hope that like the rest of everybody starts trying to like work towards and chug towards the same goals. You know what I mean? But it's not gonna be you by yourself or anything that you could do in a major way. But there are a million different ways that you can be involved on that level. And and I'm sure of it too, because I'm an immigrant and they be letting me do stuff. So I know for sure y'all can do stuff. Like Dr. J, how you do about outrage?
Well, yes. I mean, I've been outraged for 32 years, and just the way it is. I don't sleep, and that's the way it is. But I think a couple of things. One, you can't have like a hero mentality, like Olayemi saying. You're not going to go in there and like just change everything. It's daunting. It's probably the biggest social problem we face. And I think that so you have to be willing to endure, to stay with it, and you have to be willing to take losses. You know, if you as a white, I'm just talking to white people. So as a white person, if you're really going to be dedicated and really going to be anti-racist, then you're going to have to like get used to losing. You're going to have to get used to losing people in your life. You're going to have to get used to sacrifice. You're going to have to get used to those things, but you're also going to have to step up. So like what you could do with your outrage right now is that there are like all the hundreds of these school board meetings happening all across the country right now, where they're trying to ban the books and they're trying to prevent us from teaching about racism, and they're being dominated by these folks who are yelling down everybody else on the right. You can show up at those, go find them, find these school board meetings, show up, and you can fight back. You know, like use your voice. You know, you can channel your outrage that way. There are so many places and spaces where, especially right now, where people on the right are kind of like shout down everybody else. There's an opportunity for you to step up. But again, I think that you can't think that one act is going to do it, or that you're going to be heroic and you come and save the day, like the white hero thing. You know, that we see in the movies. That doesn't exist. You know, but you're going to be outraged. If you're really into it and you really feel it, then you're going to be outraged the rest of your life. It's just so pleasant, right? So happy. Happy thoughts, right?
Yeah. So
it's the way it is. If you're not outraged, but the other way I look at it is kind of like if you aren't outraged, then something's wrong, because there's so much suffering and pain going on.
And outrage isn't a bad emotion. Outrage isn't a bad emotion. Outrage is a lot better than defeat. And I think outrage is a lot better than sadness, right? Like I think every day I feel outrage every day. I wake up every day just trying to figure out how to get everybody else as outraged as me. Like, excuse me, listen up. This is as bad as I'm telling you it is. But I think the real stressful days are the days I feel filled with sadness about it more than I feel, you know what I mean, outrage. It's the days where you feel like, you know, you can't do anything about it. I think outrage is fueling. I think get used to it, and also find community. Like find people. A community is just absolutely important and can't be understated. To find like-minded people and people who are going to get that outrage, but you're going to feel better. Like when I went to court on Friday night, and this is the most upset I've been in court in I think my entire career. But a black man was charged with a misdemeanor that is otherwise not bail eligible. A prosecutor was going out of our way to make a statutory argument to try to set bail on him. He has 3 different life-threatening illnesses, right? Rikers is overcrowded. 16 people have already died in Rikers in the last year. They've already declared a state of emergency. She was going out of her way to make a statutory argument on this man who she recognizes as a triply predisposed to illness and death if he goes to Rikers. And he literally, I swear to y'all, I swear to my God, this man had a seizure, like had a major seizure. She collapsed on the ground. And this woman, a black prosecutor, by the way, and this goes back to systemic, like I keep telling you, it's a systemic problem. Putting black people and people of color in the same positions to perpetuate the same racism doesn't change it. Looked at him and just like, while this man is seizing, convulsing, and fire, I had to scream at the court. Like, I literally said to the court, "Are y'all dead ass?" Like, I couldn't even find like other words. I'm like, do something, help him. And they still, as this man has collapsed, he is seizing on the ground. They were still trying to set bail on him, judge and the prosecutor. And I was like, this is the most egregious level of moral bankruptcy I ever did witness in my life. And the worst part about it is what they do is they don't want you to, like, I can't show you what I'm seeing. I'm not allowed to take a picture of this or a video of this, because what they want is to like have you exist in this system where this is the everyday, this is the routine, but they don't want me to show people that this is the everyday shit happens, because people want to respond as though when they do hear about it, like, oh my God, it was this big error. The system did something really messed up and it was this egregious anomaly. But in fact, when you do hear about the egregious cases, all the Khalif Browders, all the cases that shock you, that is the day-to-day in court. And they rely on the fact that people are not going to come to court and come and witness this, you know, and they prevent the people that are seeing it from showing it to you. And that shit right there is a lot to deal with. And that's from the perspective of thinking, you know, oh, I'm going to go be a public defender so I could fight it from the inside or whatever it is. That's why I have to impress upon in every role, you're always going to feel like your hands are tied to what is the bigger forces, because it's a system that's just much bigger than you on every level. You're going to feel away as a defense attorney, and there are all kind of prosecutors that are, in my opinion, deluding themselves to believing that they're going to do all kind of change from the inside, and they find the same frustrations, and I know them, so I know it. Everyone feels like their hands are tied in some way because the system is set up to make us all fall in line and play our roles while it continues perpetuating this kind of injustice. So I say outrage is better than sadness, because that night I was sad. You know what I mean? Sad. I was like, I cannot keep doing this mother effing job. I was upset. Like, I had to call. But again, community. I walked out of the court and I called my coworker, like, he was at dinner. I'm like, listen to me. Listen to me. I am upset. Tell me now, because I was like, this is the day I'm going to make a scene in this court. So I think it's important to have that people that you can share with, like, what's happening and what's going on, and so that you can figure out ways to address it and to fight it in other ways, and to keep fighting. More importantly, is just to wake up and do it another day, because a lot of people just don't and won't. I have coworkers that quit like a month after training. They were like, "Ooh, I gotta be out." Like, I had coworkers come to my office like, "Oh, I gotta go," and I'm like, "What? Why? You got a better paying job?" They were like, "No, but I gotta go. I'm not doing this." So I think community. You got use outrage as a fuel, and find community for the days that outrage is defeated by sadness. That's my answer.
The community it refuels you.
Yes.
It refuels you. So that's right.
Larry.
Yeah, well, I see that we've come upon the 8 o'clock hour. So I want to thank our panelists for this excellent discussion. Olayemi, I wrote this down. The grace of living with outrage, I think is a great way to end this program. So thank you all for attending this evening. This has been a wonderful discussion, and thank you, Dr. Young-Kuntz and Attorney Olurin, for your time this evening.
All right, y'all can message me. You can give the students my email or my Twitter or whatever it is you need if you want to talk to me.
Yes, so if any of you are interested in speaking more with Attorney Olurin, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll make sure that you get in contact with her.
And y'all can call me Olay. Okay.
Thank you all.
Bye. Bye, kids.